Hey everyone, Daniel here with Benton County. We might have a few more folks joining in, so let's give it another minute or two. So far we have Chuck, Gilbert, Ian McNabb, Ken Eklund, Ginger Richardson, Mark Yeager, and Nathaniel Tisdale joining in.
Make it a little bit less of a mouthful.
Thanks, Nate. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And hopefully other folks join us. I think Sam and Parati, the work group facilitator, will probably join in at some point and provide some guidance on next steps. But we have a jam-packed agenda, so we might as well dive right in. And it looks like Sam has joined us as well. Hi, Sam.
Hey, I may have to step away briefly to pay some tradespeople, but I'll be back within a few minutes if I have to jump.
Okay, thanks. So we're just getting started. We have a pretty full agenda. The first item on the agenda, we'll skip some of the welcome and introductions and subcommittee tasks, unless Sam, you have anything you want to add before we jump in?
No, sir.
Okay. So the first item on the kind of core part of our agenda is reviewing key findings and key recommendations. So I'll go ahead and pull those up from the draft that I had sent out. And you also just recently received an email from me with Ken's latest proposed draft findings and recommendations, which I think are relatively substantial. So I can understand if we haven't had a chance to review that yet, but perhaps we can review some of those as a group today. But as we dive in, does anybody have comments on either the either the key findings or key recommendations that you received ahead of time, or on the proposed changes that Ken provided?
I haven't had a chance to review Ken's findings because they came in so recently. Ian and I did have some tweaks and adjustments we wanted to make to the existing findings and recommendations that were sent out on Friday.
Okay. Do you want to direct our attention to some of the ones that you'd like to adjust? And that way we can try to take care of it as a group.
Yep, I'm gonna pull up my reference sheet here just so I don't
Okay.
miss anything. Okay. So, and I've got some proposed new language here, but I'm gonna let Ian talk about this first one. It's finding number 1 actually, and it has to do with the East Triangle. And we're really just trying to correct the record here because there was apparently some confusion when Bill was talking about this. We were actually talking about 2 different things. So we need to make an adjustment to make this accurate.
Okay.
Ian, do you want to go into that a little bit more?
Sure. So the East Triangle was not removed. There was a section of landfill site zoned property that was removed back in 2013 from being used, but it wasn't the actual East Triangle that's referred to in CUPs. I think the confusion was it was a triangular shaped piece and it was on the east side. It was kind of just to the north of where the East Triangle was. So I think that's what caused the confusion.
Thanks, Ian. So what is your proposed change, I guess, to finding 1? How would we change it to make it
I
more
just put
accurate?
it in the chat, Daniel. So what we want to do is just replace the sentences that start at the end of the graph in 2013 Valley Landfills Inc. And we just want to swap out those 2 with what Ian just said, that it was not the East Triangle that was removed, that it was this landfill site zone property.
Okay, so I'm gonna paste the language that Ginger just sent from the chat in here. I'm gonna leave the original language just below so we can kind of compare them. So we have in 2013, Valley Landfills Inc. reevaluated an area of landfill site zoned property in the northeast corner of the site for waste placement stability engineering. This area was removed from the landfill site development plan based on updated state seismic guidance for landfill stability. And that's replacing the sentence that was there prior. Does anybody have comments or concerns about that change? All
So
right.
this is Mark. I would just say I appreciate the clarification because I was totally confused being on the land use subcommittee and looking at the CUPs, the East and the West Triangle and all that sort of stuff, that what Bill was saying the last time we got together wasn't making any sense to me. So this does help to clarify that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank Ian, because I wouldn't have caught it. I was very confused from the get-go on that. So
Yeah, I would have caught it, but I wasn't on the last meeting. So
Thank you, Ian.
All right. So hearing no other concerns, I'll go ahead and delete the former sentence here and we'll move on. And Ginger, you mentioned maybe having a couple other comments or edits.
yes, so I wanted to draw the group's attention to finding number 5. Ian and Bill and I have gone kind of back and forth on this a lot over the last week. This was one that sort of Paul and I were working on before he left the subcommittee, and we hadn't really vetted it with the group or reached consensus on it. We'd like to keep the first sentence, but recast everything that follows the word expansion, because we think it's more accurate. I'm going to drop some text in the chat. In that there's kind of 2 sides of a coin on this, and we're trying to find consensus by giving both parties a place to kind of air what they're trying to say. So we would keep the first sentence, and then our proposal is to add what I just put in the chat, starting with the subcommittee.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and do the same thing just so the group can see the proposed changes side by side. And Ginger, this is supposed to go after the first sentence,
Correct.
your proposal, okay. Okay. So after the first sentence, I'll just read it off. The subcommittee could not reach consensus on whether this could potentially pose a problem. Those representing neighbors said they were concerned that an exponential ramp up in annual tonnage could negate any expected increase in the site life that resulted from an expansion. Those representing Republic Services said it was unlikely such a scenario would occur due to operational limitations at the landfill and in the service area. And that replaced the former sentence that if intake volumes increase, an expansion would not necessarily guarantee an increase in site life or the extension of the landfill's closure date. For example, if an expansion increases available airspace, but intake volumes increase the fill rate even more, the overall life of the landfill could decrease.
Yeah, I was basically given some new information that, you know, not being a landfill engineer, I didn't have previously, and Ian can address this a little as well. But essentially, while there is a concern that I fully understand and accept, that Paul and others on the subcommittee had expressed about an expansion not necessarily yielding an increase in site life. Operationally, it is my understanding that it would be difficult, if not almost impossible, for us to put enough waste on an annual tonnage basis into the landfill to make that scenario become a reality. Ian, am I characterizing that properly?
Yeah, I mean, just operationally and the size of the site, it just wouldn't be feasible to put that much more waste on an annual basis to actually reduce the overall site life.
So what we're trying to do here is get it like at both the neighborhood concerns, the community concerns that were expressed by Paul and I think Ken and Mark previously, but also sort of explain why we don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, thanks, Ginger, and thanks, Ian. I had one thought that could potentially as an option to sort of bridge the gap between these two, but I wanted to first hear from the group. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I guess I would like to hear what you have to say, Daniel. I'm concerned that I don't think this says, I think this goes pretty far off target from what was being said previously. And I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around how operationally it couldn't happen that the tonnage would increase. And I don't know about exponentially, but that the tonnage would increase significantly, and that you couldn't handle that, because it seems to me like if you get approval for expansion, or if Republic gets approval for an expansion on the south side of Coffin Butte Road, and the quarry is still being excavated, there could be certainly an opportunity for the quarry area to be opened up at some point in the future, and garbage going into both sides of the road. Yeah, it would involve some additional staff and things like that, but yeah, I guess the nuance of how this is now proposed to be worded doesn't really get at it from my perspective. But Daniel, I'm happy to hear what you have to say, and happy to hear any other clarification from Republic folks.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead and jump in. I think generally I like the idea of trying to frame these findings where there's consensus first and foremost. And it sounds like the original version, there's general consensus, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ginger and Ian, but that you're not so much arguing that this sentence is incorrect, but that it doesn't highlight the sort of limitations operationally that might reduce the likelihood of that scenario from occurring. So I'm wondering if we could leave the original sentence as is, and then at the end tag on maybe your last sentence saying those representing Republic Services said it was an unlikely such a scenario would occur due to operational limitations, essentially capturing the operational limitations concern while also leaving the original sentence, which seemed like nobody's really arguing against that. And so that's my idea. I have Ken's hand up if you want to take it away, Ken.
Sure. But it seems like there's kind of an unstated underlying assumption in here, which is that the expansion is of a certain size or larger. You know, it's possible that the expansion is actually quite small, in which case it's be fairly easy, essentially, for the site life to decrease, because you're not really adding anything to the volume, but you are opening up the possibility. And you know, that scenario might manifest in a case where there is indeed an opportunity in the service area, which is why the application is being sought. You know, so I guess, so I just have that point to make. There seems to be an assumption here, but also kind of like Mark, I would like to just hear what exactly the operational limitations at the landfill and the operational limitations in the service area. What does that actually mean? What are we actually talking about?
Ian, can you address?
Daniel, if you want to, if you're okay. From an operational standpoint, it sounds good that you could have two separate areas that you're operating, but from a financial standpoint, it wouldn't make much sense because you're having to purchase twice the amount of equipment and more employees and everything else. It just, from a cost standpoint, it wouldn't make sense to try to do that. And then I guess as far as a service area, there's really only so many tons of waste in a service area, and they've basically all have places they're going right now. So there just isn't another 1 million tons or something a year that would come to Coffin Butte.
So I have Sam on the screen, and I see Ken, your hand is up. Do you have a comment? Okay. Sam, if you want to provide some feedback here, and then we can see if we can come to a conclusion on this one.
Unfortunately, this is when I had to step away, and so I have not heard anything that in the last 7 minutes. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. Maybe we'll catch you up, but essentially we're looking at this finding 5. Republic proposed some changes after the first sentence, which is in there currently, and then the original sentence is this one below. Mark.
Yeah, I just like, Daniel, I think your proposal is fine. I don't know how Republic folks feel about it, but your proposal to take the sentence that was there before, put it back in, and then put the qualifier at the end from Republic. And we could also say we could not reach consensus on this issue. I don't like the wording on whether this could pose a problem, but we could state explicitly that subcommittee could not reach consensus on this issue. And I think putting that sentence back in and adding the qualifier that Republic says it's not operationally likely, that sort of justifies no consensus.
Thanks, Mark. Any thoughts from Republic folks on that adjusted proposal here? If we essentially leave it as is and add your last sentence to the finding, would that do the trick?
I mean, I'm not crazy about it, but, you know, in an effort to get us to consensus, I'm willing to accept it.
Okay, any other comments or ideas from the group? Okay, so hearing none, I guess we'll go with that latter proposal. I'll pop it in here to show how it'll look final. And with that in there, I just want to make sure I'm capturing everything. Make sure I didn't miss anything here.
The only thing you might do editing wise there, Daniel, is take out those representing, because those representing was sort of parallel to those representing the neighbors. So you just say Republic Services said it was unlikely such a scenario would occur.
That makes sense. Thanks, Mark.
I do think we'll probably want to, as Mark suggested a minute ago, put something in there that, you know, indicates that we're having trouble with consensus on this issue. I'm okay leaving it as it is right now, but like, I know we've got a couple of more meetings to get through in the interest of time, but I want to think about whether it makes sense to put that phrase or verbiage in there.
Okay.
Do you want me to continue? I have just a few more.
Yeah, please continue. I'm going to highlight this could not reach consensus, so we can tag it here. And if we come up with any other thoughts, we can revisit it.
All right. Looking at finding 6, we wanted to strike the last sentence in that finding. Ian's going to have to talk more about this than I, because I'm not familiar with what goes into the EPA data, but I think as it's written, Ian, is it inaccurate as it was written, or just confusing? Can you kind of help me out?
Well, it's confusing. So this is from greenhouse gas reporting. And when the program was originally rolled out in 2010, site capacity wasn't even part of the reporting program. Later on, it was added at some point, but it's really just informational. It's not actual any kind of hard number. The actual greenhouse gas reporting is based off of the tonnage that comes in a set year. So really, it's just not very relevant to site capacity.
Okay, so and so the proposal is removing the last sentence would sort of solve that issue from Republic's perspective.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, see, Ken in the chat says he's on board with removing the last sentence. Any other concerns with that? Okay, I apologize. My computer is running on the slow side here. So once I'm able to move forward, I will. Okay. All right. Can everyone still see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I removed that last sentence. And should we move forward, Ginger, with your,
Yes.
yeah.
I'm actually looking at same thing on finding 9. I don't have the specific language on this, but my understanding is that Greg Verrett and the legal subcommittee have addressed the issue, or are addressing the issue about when cell 6 was approved as a disposal area, and that they are both. Greg has provided some sort of memo that indicates that it was approved as in in documents. So I would like to remove that last sentence. Based on what the legal subcommittee is discussing, but if we need to hold on that until we get that language from the legal subcommittee, that's fine. I just want to flag it here.
Thanks, Ginger. Yeah, I think I would like to retain it at least until we can have whatever language replaces it, if that's okay with the group. But that's my idea, to essentially flag this and get the latest language from the legal subcommittee so we can work with that if that works for the group.
It's fine with me.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, that's fine with me. I'm curious why it went to the legal subcommittee, because the land use stuff is, well, I'll be interested to hear what the legal subcommittee comes up with, whether or not they're referencing a specific conditional use permit application that was approved that created it. So I agree. Let's wait. Let's flag it, not remove it. That'll be fine. Thanks.
And then I just had a question for the group on 10. Is it me, or is 10 the same as 9, but in a different way? Maybe I'm missing something, but it looks like to me that we're saying sort of the same thing here, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
No, zoom in for the group so we can see
And
them.
I think you had flagged this one too.
Yeah, they're just very similar. I think one's using like the 9 million yards came from like the conditional use permit applications as the estimated amount, and I'm not sure where the 6 million, but it's talking about the same additions of the east and west triangles. So it seems like these could be consolidated down into one, or one of them eliminated, because they're fairly redundant.
It looks like there's some information in 10 that's not in 9, but it looks like there's some duplicated information between the two. So that might just be some wordsmithing.
Thank you. Yeah, Mark, go for it.
I can tell you that the 9 million cubic yards is the correct number. I'm not sure what the 6 million cubic yards is. I've looked at the land use application that went in 2003, and that was east and west triangle. That's what we were talking about earlier. And the total of those two was 9 million cubic yards. So I'm not sure what the 6 is, but the last sentence in 10 is in fact different and adds some more information. So I guess I would support moving that up into 9, and possibly anything else that is in there.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, the main things that I'm noticing are sort of unique is the basically after
right,
since 2004.
Right.
So how does the group feel about basically moving this sentence, since 2004 reported remaining airspace has decreased gradually while total permitted airspace has remained somewhat constant? As of the end of 2021, approximately 44% of permitted capacity remained unused, essentially moving that into the end of finding 9.
Yep, I agree with that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Fine.
Okay.
Hi, Daniel, Chuck, just one quick question, if I may.
Yeah.
I know we're bouncing back and forth, but cell 6 as a disposal area has not been identified or confirmed. That isn't correct, is it? Because the engineering drawings, which we accepted, shows area 6 and has not EPA, DEQ approved that for a disposal site, or am I wrong? I'm not sure how you're qualifying that there.
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, I think so. The approval for cell 6, I believe, is talking more specifically about the county's approval for disposal in cell 6, where the legal subcommittee and county staff are essentially reviewing to figure out when or if cell 6 was approved as a disposal area within the landfill zone. So we could add county approval here if that makes us, and I know we're tagging this sentence to review anyways, but if that works for the group in the meantime, we can write county approval to make it more clear.
Yeah, thank you, because I thought it was already in the DEQ domain of being approved, if I'm
It
right.
is,
It is,
it's in the DEQ, yeah.
yes,
It's the county
yeah,
document that
yeah.
we've had some discussions about.
Yeah, it should be balanced out a little bit, that if it's a zoning problem, it's one thing. If it's a permitting problem, it's another thing. It appears that the permitting process has been approved. The county's concern is a land use.
Yeah, I think that's fair, is whether or not the county has approved the land use for that area. Okay, so we've added county in there to clarify it. The proposal is removing finding 10, the remainder of finding 10. Does that work for the group?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
I would like to draw the group's attention to finding 23. This is probably the most significant one for Republic Services. This surmises that we would knowingly, willingly violate our existing contract, and this is not one we can support. We cannot support that finding. And so this is sort of the one finding and recommendation within all of these that there's just not a place for us where we feel like we can get to a compromise, because we feel like this is just a purely speculative finding and statement that we are going to behave as a bad actor.
Thanks, Ginger. So the proposal is to remove this, or do you have any language to replace it?
There's not really any language that I could put in there that I think we would be comfortable with. I think we're saying, look, the group either has to agree to remove this, or we will just not. Republic Services will end up writing a memo saying that we can't support this one, and that'll be a 3 in our polling. We don't want to go to that level, and I think we're in all the subcommittees, we're working just as everybody else is. All of the residents and volunteers who've given up their time, everybody's trying to get to a point where they're comfortable with something, but this is just not one where we see ourselves getting comfortable with that.
Thanks, Ginger. Mark, go for it.
So I'm sorry that I haven't been necessarily consistently attending all these meetings. And so I'm curious about the genesis of this finding. I hear what Ginger is saying on behalf of Republic, but I don't think that necessarily mitigates the residents near the landfill their concerns, because having closely reviewed the franchise agreement, the enforcement mechanisms are very limited. It basically is binding arbitration as a means for enforcing any of the provisions of the franchise agreement. So again, maybe somebody could help me understand where this finding came from. It would provide some useful context for me in evaluating Republic's proposal.
Yeah, I can provide a little bit of context for you and the group. I added a comment here, but essentially this is a comment that I added after having a conversation with Paul, essentially trying to get to the root of the, what's the root finding of the discussion about the 2000 franchise agreement and the 2020 franchise agreement. And there's a lot of points essentially about the tonnage limit in the 2000 agreement and the limit in the 2020 agreement, and how to refer to them and all of this. And essentially the conclusion that I made based on the conversation with Paul was that really this is like the concern that is highlighted from Paul's perspective. I ran that by Paul. It seemed like that captured a lot of what he was getting at. So we added this in here for the group's review. And Ken.
Yeah, of course, Paul's not here, so some of us, I think, have to fill in for him. You know, Ginger, you characterize this really as, you know, Republic being the bad guy. You know, I'm not sure that we really need to go to that sort of moral language. I mean, we're talking about business here. You know, the way I view this comment, it's not so much about Republic. It's about kind of a lack of faith that county residents have in the county actually kind of standing up to you know, pressures, especially monetary pressures. You know, and so I'm looking for some way that we can, you know, indeed express that concern. You know, there isn't really you know, if we can talk more about what enforcement mechanisms, you know, are actually there, for example, you know, that would be reassuring. But you know, as things stand now, you know, that essentially is, you know, I think a valid neighborhood concern, you know, a resident's concern, you know, that there isn't a spelled out enforcement mechanism. There can be the sort of erosion, you know, that we've seen on other conditions that have applied with the landfill, you know, where the county hasn't really stepped forward to make sure that things are being enforced. So anyway, I'm pushing back against the idea of just deleting this entirely. I'm looking for language that we can use, you know, to let residents know they've been heard.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, to be very blunt, the first half of the sentence is much more problematic to me than the second half of the sentence. If somebody wanted to propose recasting that finding, you know, focusing on, Ken, some of the concerns that you were saying are at the root of it, whether the county, you know, has enough teeth, or its documents have enough teeth to enforce compliance with its contracts. I'd be open to looking at it if it's casted in that vein.
So we have a proposal from Ginger and Ken, and Sam, I see your hand. I just wanted to get a sense of how the group feels about that as well.
I have a couple of questions. Yeah, I can't tell from my screen right now. We're off in the comments section. What the first comment, proposed delete and then added to capture, and then Paul saying not sure it warrants a finding. What are those relating to?
So this proposed delete is for finding 22, but the one that the statement is true, but I'm not sure if it warrants a finding, is about the one that we're talking about now, finding 23.
Okay, so my initial reaction here is that this exercise was never designed to create findings on what the various community interests, business interests, any interests are concerned about. I mean, that's for the public comment period and other resources. So that first part of the sentence here, a finding that some members of the landfill are concerned, I don't think it's an appropriate finding for this group. I mean, we're not trying to capture whatever the pros and cons. The charter specifically says we're not opining on the merits of any CUP condition. But if there's a way, and then the second part about the agreement's enforcement mechanisms of whether or not it's viable, you know, that's covered in the legal subcommittee report, which people are going to be able to comment upon. If you know, if there's a way to write the second part of that clause. I mean, and you guys can agree. I'm certainly not going to stand in the way of it, but that's all I got for the moment.
Thanks, Sam. I have Chuck and then Mark.
The only thing I would specify before I would agree or disagree, it says the 22 franchise agreement, but it doesn't call out the paragraph or anything in the agreement where to find the fact that there is a provision. You see what I'm getting at? If they would have said the 2020 landfill franchise agreement in paragraph so-and-so, then that gives it fact, but in this way, there's no fact associated with it, if you see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think generally the findings are intended to link to to where this is more spelled out in the document. And I believe the document does go into that level of detail of, which clause the 1.1 million tons comes up. But that's a good point. We should be keeping that in mind, that the reader should easily have access to the more detailed information about this.
Yeah, but just for our edification here to see if the fact is true, specifically, that's all I'm talking about.
Okay. And then Mark.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that, both here in our work that we've been doing and the review of data relative to waste volumes and the 2000 franchise agreement threshold limit, wherever we ended up on that, those limits or that line was exceeded, and the county didn't do anything to require a new baseline study, which was the explicit consequence of exceeding the threshold. And then on the land use side, there have been many things identified. And through that process, the county has acknowledged that they don't monitor or enforce land use conditions. So we have, if you will, evidence of the county's unwillingness or inability to take enforcement action, whether it be on the land use side or on the franchise agreement side. So maybe that's where this finding needs to be focused. I'm supporting, I think, what Ken was saying earlier, that it isn't necessarily casting Republic as a bad actor, but that the county in its historic actions has not moved to enforce things that they had the ability to enforce, if that makes any sense.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so I'm open to a proposal here for this finding 23 on what we'd like to see with this one. Generally, it seems like maybe removing this first sentence and focusing on the county's enforcement mechanisms might be a path forward that was sort of lightly proposed. So I've
Daniel,
Sam. Oh yeah, go for it, Ginger.
I was just gonna say, if you want to just flag it for now, I mean, we've got 2 days till our next meeting, I think. And Ken and Mark and I might be able to just email back and forth and craft something real quick that gets us there.
Okay, and Sam, I see your hand, and then Mark, if you want to weigh in on that.
No,
piece
that's
as well.
okay. I was just going to point out that Ken had put in a chat message to say that essentially what Ginger just said. Let's try to work together and focus some language on the enforcement mechanisms.
Thanks, Mark. So my suggestion is I think consistent with that. Again, the state of the mind of any constituency is not subject to a finding here that helps us. I think the point people are trying to make is there are issues surrounding the to what extent, if any, the county actually enforces these things. And this might be a good place for a cross finding, so that this finding basically says, C, CUP finding, ... And capture the issue that way. And so people see the interconnection between these subcommittees' work. I don't want us to relitigate that issue, which seems to have been successfully resolved in the past CUP subcommittee here. I think just cross-referencing it or copy and pasting it in with a cross-reference could be the simplest way to get you to a consensus.
I think that would be fine, Sam, just as long as we also touched on the franchise agreement aspects of it versus just the land use aspects of it, because like I said,
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's evidence the county has done no enforcement on either end of that.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to preclude the franchise agreement
Okay,
there.
all right.
I'm just saying the concept is we've already worked on this issue.
All right, great.
All right,
Okay.
and sorry, go for it, Ginger.
I was just gonna say, I have one more change at this juncture, and it's a really, really, really teeny tiny one. There are a couple of things I'm still looking at, but for right now, in finding 28, could we change will in the first sentence to could? Because it's a futuristic sentence, and will implies, I don't even know what word I'm looking for. Will implies
Certainty. Yeah.
certainty. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense. Any concerns with that?
Words. Sometimes they come out of my mouth. Sometimes they get lost. And that's all I've got right now.
All right, so the proposal is for replace will with could in finding 28. Anybody have objections? Ken says could is good.
Now we're on.
Fine by me.
All right, hearing no objections, we can move forward here. Ginger and Ian, was that the bulk of it, or were there any recommendations that you wanted to dive into?
That's the bulk of it. There's a couple of things that I'm still reviewing language on, but like I said, those were the big ones.
Okay, and Ken, I just want to give you a chance to direct our attention to the findings and recommendations that you sent in, and kind of maybe you can give us a brief synopsis, 5 minutes or less on your proposal. We can pull up that email and see how the group feels about them.
That would be fine, I guess. It's a little awkward, I think, to have people look at things for the first time. I didn't really intend for them to be subject matter for today's meeting. But yeah, if you can pull that up, we can go ahead and do that.
Okay. Yeah, and we don't have to dive into the details if that doesn't make sense, but I wanted to at least give you an opportunity to sort of explain the overview of the findings if that works for you, but we can always, I'm hoping to cover it sooner than later so we can get through them, but we can postpone it till
So
next meeting as
I
well.
think maybe we can just do that without actually calling them up, because
Okay.
what we're going to end up doing is just going to be in this thing where we're all silent and reading them. And to me, that's just really grading use of meeting time. I'd rather have people have a chance to read them and respond that way.
Sure,
So
go for it.
So, basically the overview, I've just been proceeding, working on trying to get completion of the report portion, getting that pushed along to, where certain promises I had made, if only to myself, to get some material done, I have that done. And so I've really just gone through that material, derived findings and recommendations from it, and added those to the mix. And I know there was a placeholder at one point in time just saying, findings to be added here, based upon what we come up with in section 3 and in section 4, which is now the appendix. So I'm not sure that I need to really state more of an overview than that. It's really just getting back to what's going on in the document. And I know that what's going on in the report. And I know that what's going on in the report hasn't been finalized. And so we're going to get into this kind of bounce back and forth, where we change things in the report, which are going to change things in the findings, et cetera. But I don't know how else to proceed at this point. I see hands are up.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. So I had Ginger and then Mark.
Yeah, Ken, my only question was, I haven't had a chance to look at these, obviously, but are you proposing that these replace or augment what is already in the document?
Augment.
Okay,
They're new.
thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And just a quick follow-up question. Are some of them changing current text, or are most of them additional findings and recommendations? I was trying to place them. I wasn't sure how they fit in.
Almost all of them are just completely new. They're
Okay.
labeled as, they're not numbered. They just have X for a number.
Okay.
There are a couple which just kind of, there are a couple that reflect ones that are adjacent to the material that they're covering. So findings that had already been done for that section, for example, some of those I've edited too, but I'm not sure that I changed any existing language. Again, just added, a further elaboration sentence or stuff like that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Ken. Mark, I saw your hand. I didn't want to lose it just in case you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. My question was the same as Ginger's. Because I only glanced at what came in the email. I wanted to know if these were replacing, new, what they were. So Ken's response to Ginger's question was what I was hoping to hear. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So the only other, well, Ginger, I see your hand. If you want to dive in.
I just forgot to take it down. Thanks.
Okay. And so the only other question I had, it was more big picture about findings as it relates to, can some of your findings focus a lot on like greenhouse gas emissions? And I know a lot of our findings recommendations currently relate pretty directly to like one of the charge elements. And I guess the question is, I think the gist of your greenhouse gas emissions related findings are to support other findings associated with the potential future of landfill longevity. So this is sort of findings to support claims on landfill longevity, but not really findings to directly fit in with like a charge that says we're covering greenhouse gas emission findings for this group. And I guess the question is a question for Sam and for Ken and for the group is, how do we want to approach, how far away do we get from the finding? If I'm explaining it well, I'm basically trying to understand how detailed do we get into findings and how far removed from the direct sort of charge should we be aiming at here? And Ken, I'll let you jump in first, and then maybe we can get some feedback from Sam and the rest of the group as well.
Sure. Well, I've tried to keep those findings and recommendations really having to do with, there is a direct relationship between essentially environmental legislation and the operating life of the landfill. So I've really tried to direct the findings that I've got, and the stuff in the report as well, is really just referring to that. So yeah, that's I think that's what I can say about that.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And Mark.
So I'm gonna pass for the moment because my comment doesn't have anything to do with this conversation you opened. But before we move on to the next topic, I'll give you some feedback.
Sorry,
Thanks.
I didn't catch your hand, Mark.
No worries,
Sorry.
No worries. It's okay. I just don't want to sidetrack us here.
And Sam, I was wondering if you can provide some guidance here to that last question of, how directly are we aiming for these findings to support our charge? And I think I'm not necessarily saying these findings don't support the charge directly. I think it can be argued that way. I just wanted to kind of get clarification as we dive in and start adding more findings and recommendations.
So I did not have a chance to read the findings and recommendations that came out in the last 72 hours or what have you. So it's hard for me to make a comment without appreciating the context. As a general matter, I have been laboring perhaps incorrectly under the assumption that the portion of this subcommittee's report that's going into the body of the work group report, that 30 some pages or what have you, was pretty much agreed to in principle, but for the what is it, section 4 or something that talks about potential future scenarios, which are being teed up to go to the SMMP person to fully vet. But if that's not accurate or I'm missing something, you're going to have to give me more context, Daniel, than what I've been able to discern on this call.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I'll generally, I think we'll have to dive into it more on Wednesday. Everyone's received Ken's comments or Ken's proposed changes to findings, recommendations in the meantime, and I think we'll have to dive into them in more detail. I think the gist from my perspective is, we have a finding that essentially says, future scenarios of human factors essentially can impact landfill life, right? And now essentially I'm trying to determine how many additional findings, recommendations should go into supporting that kind of more global recommendation already that sort of captures the that human factors can impact landfill life. So that I started wanting to wrap my head around, how do we approach this? How do we approach the level of detail for like supporting details for certain findings and recommendations? But since we really haven't had a chance to dive into it very much, I think we might want to leave that till Wednesday. Yeah, Ken.
So just calling back to kind of how we got to where we are. So, it first came up, right, that there's environmental movements afoot, if you will, which can impact the landfill life, because they are indeed looking at what goes into the landfill and what comes out of the landfill in terms of methane. So, and the response of the subcommittee was to say, we don't want to do anything speculative. We want to have something which is really grounded on what is actually happening, not something which is potential in the future. And so that's really where, the treatment of that subject has gone. It's really looking at recent legislation. We didn't want to have things that were really very speculative. We wanted to have things which were a continuation, if you will, supported by evidence in the future. And so that's what's appeared in the document. There was indeed more speculative stuff in there at one time, which has since been deleted. We're really focusing on kind of what is happening right at the moment, things that have happened recently, legislation has passed, that sort of thing. So that's the the evolution, as I see it, of kind of this material. It's been responsive to what the subcommittee has, and members of the subcommittee have really asked for. And we've, I've certainly really tried to hold it to, kind of the factual basis that people identified as something that, that would be what they were most interested in seeing. And by extension, I would think that the Board of Commissioners and the public would like to see, in this document.
Thanks, Ken. And Chuck.
I appreciate what Ken is saying, but also, that is along with fundamentally a difference between a circular economy and a linear economy within the context of the landfill. And I think really what Ken is doing well is bridging that for the SMMP, but I think the brunt of the lift, if you will, has to be really encompassed with the SMMP. So we don't get so far out of capacity and so forth, but just give an inlight, something that this supports a circular economy that can be addressed with SMMP to give it significance, if you will.
Okay, thanks, Chuck. Well, I think let's go ahead and dive into these more on Wednesday, but I think that's a pretty good segue into our next agenda items here.
Don't forget about me.
Oh,
Sorry.
I totally did, Mark. I'm sorry about that. Go
That's
for
okay, Daniel. So on that page that you had up just at the very last minute, so findings, you had 27, 28, I think about that. I don't know where exactly we were. If you bring that back up just for a moment. There you go. Perfect. Oops, it was perfect.
Oh, sorry.
Then you moved me around. Okay. Finding number 32, just to clarify, where it says SWAC and CAC, I think you should spell out that it is the North Benton County Citizens Advisory Committee. Yeah, it's not North Benton County. It's CAC was fine. I just wanted to make sure that people understood, because there are a couple of different CACs in the county. And this one was a specific one that was in existence in 1983, no longer exists now. So that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Does anyone have concerns about that change?
Yes, I do.
Yes, go for it, Ken.
It seems like right after CAC, there's the word with that is extraneous. That's it.
Thanks, Ken. I didn't see that.
Excellent. All right. Any other comments on this one? Okay. So I think that will do it. Let's open it up back up to the group. Is there any comments, findings, and recommendations that we haven't covered yet that we want to cover before we move on to other agenda items? Okay, so generally with these, I'm going to start going through and essentially accepting some of the comments as we've had more and more opportunity to go through them as a group and not really finding issues. I'll try to go through, accept comments or complete comments, resolve comments, I guess, and then that way we can focus on, areas that we really need to focus on where comments have essentially more meaning and can drive us to areas of discussion. So with that said, I think our next agenda item is going into section 3 and the former section 4, which I think is back into section 3 now. So if I don't hear any concerns, we can jump into that section 3 here. And Ken, I know you added some comments to this table that I think we should go through because we have some essentially Ken's comments were recommendations to change what existed there, so we have sort of which option to go with to pose to the group. And does anybody else have any other areas that they really want to focus on for section 3 that is sort of unfinished? I know the EPA stuff on this table, we have several comments on that we can touch on briefly. Anything else in section 3 that folks are hoping to dive into today? Okay, so let's go through. I'm gonna briefly stop my share, make sure I can get to the right section here. I apologize, I'm having one of those computer days that does not want to cooperate with me. Okay, so first up is the chart. And Ken had a good comment about essentially how we rolled the comments into this chart. And I think Ken was the only person to provide comment on this. So I'll go over it briefly. Essentially, for most of the background items, if there's an A and a B, it's sort of two competing backgrounds that we would need to choose which one to go with, or a combination of the two, I can imagine might be the case. For the questions, the 1, 2, 3, I wanted to differentiate from an A and B, mainly because some questions compete with one another, but other questions don't necessarily, like they can coexist. So I wanted to capture that. But frankly, I just did not have the time to dive in and find the exact differences and try to meld them. I'm just at the point where I can't do that level of detailed analysis while I'm adding these comments in here. So that's the gist of it. Ken.
Yeah, just pushing back a little bit on that characterization, and I'm just very wary about us starting to get into this sort of versioning problem again, where we have version A, version B. It's certainly not intended by me or anyone, I think, to actually create that. So, what happened is, when we look at this chart, we had arrays earlier, and Ginger did a great job of moving the information, in those different versions of the arrays into this chart. And she filled in areas. So like when we're looking here at this first one, the one that's A under background is what she put in. And so I have just filled out that explanation because there are some things in the old array which I felt should have been carried forward into this space. And so B is actually my restatement of what Ginger had, and I added the more because there is a thing that it refers to down below. But they're not meant to be versions that we're looking at. This is just my adding to what Ginger had proposed, looking at the source material that she was indeed working from. So it's an entirely different mindset. And I just have to say that we have some technical issues, going on, in that for some reason I can't do I can't do change tracking in tables, which is kind of how this whole problem manifested itself. It kind of has a technical component to it, but I don't think that it should be characterized as essentially being versions.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go for it.
Oh, so I just, the method that we have been using in this, in the subcommittee very successfully, I think, is where we have successive versions of language. And, if we get into some sort of situation where there's some sort of, if somebody puts in A and then someone puts in B and then someone puts A back in and B, we haven't really had that problem. Things have really moved towards consensus. And that's being short-circuited by how this is being presented at the moment. Instead, it's being turned into an A versus B kind of battle when it was never intended to be that way. So I'm just trying to kind of hope that we can come to some sort of reversion to where we have the most recent proposed language for things.
Thanks, Ken. I have a comment for that, but Sam, go for it.
Well, I just want to make sure I'm tracking. Ken, are you saying that you want your proposal is to have A and B in there?
No, I'm saying that there used to be A in this cell of this table. And then I said, oh, I think that what we really should have is we should have, and I have B in there. And as you can see, what was in A is actually in B. But there's just more, yeah.
So you are suggesting that we pick between A or B in this particular moment, correct?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that in the past we had A, now in the present we should have B, and A has been incorporated into B in all these cases.
So as an editing matter, Daniel you're suggesting that B be the only one in there and that A goes away. So it is a choice between A or B as the one remaining background point that goes here.
Well, I don't know how to describe it any differently than kind of what I've already said.
I can do an attempt, Ken,
yeah,
if you
please,
want.
Daniel, help me out.
So I think here's how I'm understanding it. Essentially, the way we're presenting the options, I think Ken's point is that, when Ken is writing in to say, hey, this is what I'm proposing to be in this cell, he's asking for that to be the item that shows up in the cell. And so we don't see A when it's presented to the group. Did I capture that, Ken, just as a method for presenting that information?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
I mean, in the past, in other portions of the documents, we have this sort of timeline for it, where you can go back in different versions and see what it used to be in the past. We've just for, almost by accident, we've subverted that for this, and it's kind of caused this, what I think is going, it's already becoming this sort of time suck.
Thanks, Ken. Sam, do you want to?
Well, so I get the past. I'm only really focused on in this moment now. If the subcommittee approves, Ken, you would want the language in A removed and the only language left be the paragraph that you wrote, correct? That's how your suggestion is to fix this problem in the moment.
Yes, if people want to go back into the past, to evaluate that just the way they could normally, that's what would be done.
Okay, so Ginger and your team, have you had a chance to look at Ken's B, for lack of a better term? Ginger, are you available by chance?
I'm here. I'm sorry. I've got 3 screens up and I could not figure out which one I was supposed to unmute. I actually haven't, and that's my fault because I'm guessing this has been out there for a while and it just completely slipped my radar, but I'm happy to kind of just go through and look at it between now and Wednesday. If Ken says that he basically took the spirit of what was in the original statement and just, fleshed it out a little bit more for context, then I'm sure there won't be too many issues, if any at all.
So related to that, then, under the questions associated with this first example here, is there a way to identify, maybe it's in the comments, which I can't at least see on my screen right now, that explains all this, but is there a way to say which ones are Ken's? I mean, which ones are the proposed improvements?
I've added comments to pretty much all the items that anybody has submitted with who submitted them. So this table generally, the only comments that we've received so far have been from Ginger and Republic Service Team proposing the original, and Ken proposing edits to that original. So I don't think there's anybody else besides Republic and Ken who have added comments. Maybe I might have added comments as well.
So just as a practical matter, I'm trying to focus in on what of these 1, 2, and 3s, is there a clean way, and maybe by it's using a different color to distinguish between what was the so-called original? We know in the background it was A, and then B is Ken's proposed rewrite. But looking at questions 1, 2, or 3 without simultaneously trying to translate what's out in the comment fields, it's not clear which ones are duplicative, which ones are new, which ones are what have you. So I'm trying to come up with a process to make this review more efficient, because we do not have much more runway here
Yeah,
to
so
deal with this.
comments 2 and 3 were added by Ken. Sorry, items 2 and 3 were added by Ken, and I believe they're to replace number 1. And
So it's that,
that's all called out throughout the document.
yeah, but you have to go and read and translate and what have you. I'm just wondering if there's a cleaner way to, I mean, I don't know that we much care. I guess I'm wondering, do we need the detail that's in the bubbles on the side versus simply, unless they have a comment or suggestion, as opposed to simply saying 2 and 3 appear to be, and we should ask Ken, he'll know, there are replacements for and or in additions to the initial question.
So we can ask Ken, certainly. I think generally, if we focus too much on process stuff at this point, we're not going to get through this. And I think what we should do instead is go, unfortunately, line by line where there is these items and just address them. And Ken can speak to what he added and whether or not it was intended to replace what was originally there. To my point earlier, we do not have the staff time to go through when there isn't track changes available. We can't go through and try to discern that and integrate things seamlessly. At this stage, we just have way too much going on.
Let's just get to, but apparently we're not going to be able to do it if Ginger hasn't had time to look at this, because there's some, there's some significant additions and reworks there. I'm not saying they're wrong or inappropriate, but I mean, are we really going to be able to do this efficiently in real time if Republic hasn't done what it wants to propose to either in support of, in modification of, or rejection of Ken's additions?
We have Ken's hand.
Yes, I think this is something that is better done offline. I don't think that there's anything that Ginger and I are actually going to not be able to work out. So, certainly when I was writing them, I was not intending on stomping on anything or whatever. I'm just trying to bring forward the material which was existing before to make sure that it gets reflected in kind of this new way that Ginger has framed, the ideas. And so, to me, this is something which like Sam says, I think it's just waiting for Republic to actually take a look and we can work that out. And it would be, because we're having a technical issue here, I think there would be something that would be better done in writing than it is to try to kind of work it out in the meetings. I'm really conscious of the things which really kind of take a lot of time. And yeah, and that's just it. I mean, in every case, I was indeed taking what Ginger had put and expanding it. The problem is you can't tell without reading the little things what Ginger had put in which, and that's, that's a formatting issue. That's not any sort of inherent issue.
So
Got it.
sorry, go for it, Sam.
No, I mean, the only one thing on question 2, I don't think the first question is appropriate for the SMMP person. Will an application to expand the landfill be approved? It either will be or it won't be. It's if, you know, the way it seems to be is if an application to expand is approved, how many years will be added to it? We're not asking the SMMP person if it's going to be approved. Now that'll be a fact one way or the other. We're not asking, will it be approved? Well, no.
So before, Ken, I see your hand just before you respond. I'm wondering, so we had a proposal to take this offline. I do think that a conversation needs to happen. I mean, this is the same situation that we got into with findings and recommendations. At some point, the folks that have comments on this need to talk about it. So I'm gonna really push back against offline work at this point. We're sort of at the final hour. We've done so much offline work. We've contributed so many pages of content, and I'm wondering if anybody would volunteer to work together offline, quote unquote, but in a meeting to go back and forth and go line by line, just figure out which cells need to have what content. I'm happy to do it now and start that conversation as a whole group. But if we think it's a better use of our time to do it in like a subcommittee, that's fine too, whoever wants to volunteer for that. But I don't think that this is going to get worked out by sending a document back and forth to one another. We have to have the conversation. That's what these meetings are for. And sorry, Ken, I know your hand was up earlier, so you don't have to respond to that one necessarily. You can say what you were saying earlier.
Well, I do want to respond to that one. And I just don't understand at all, essentially the idea that we can't work things out in written form. You know, I'm just looking at how many things we've got, where our time is going to in these meetings. And, you know, it just seems like there's this sort of, and if we're now saying that in order for us to actually get this project done, it seems to me, we have to really be looking at things being done offline. You know, otherwise it's just this kind of endless number of hours of meetings to work these out with things that could be done more efficiently offline. So I'm just pushing back on that right now.
Thanks,
you know,
Ken.
I'm not volunteering for those meetings.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I think my thought would be that since I wrote the original version and Ken wrote the fleshed out version, it would just make sense for him and I to just work it out if the rest of the subcommittee trusts us to be their proxy. And, you know, if he and I can find some time to do it and make a commitment that we come back with compromise language or, you know, a handful of areas where we haven't compromised for the subcommittee on Wednesday, then let's do it that way. You know, I want to be thoughtful and I want to give it the time that it's due, but I also, you know, this is not the only project I'm working on right now. And I've got 2 or 3 different subcommittees that I'm tracking just on Coffin Butte. And then I've got like other projects all around the country that I'm working on. So being, you know, blocking out times for meetings is very difficult to me because my schedule is already really, really packed. And so if I can just work one-on-one going back and forth, if everybody's comfortable with that, then I think that would be the most efficient given the time frame that we have left. Those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Ginger. So how does the group feel about Ginger and possibly Ken or whoever else volunteers to be working on this? It sounds like in email format, back and forth, sending the revised documents back and forth to one another. Does that sound okay to the group? See a thumbs up from Ken. Excellent. So hearing no other concerns here, we're going to revisit this table. We don't have a ton of time to get this work done. So we'll check back in with you in the next couple of meetings and see how it's coming along. Yeah, Ken.
Yes, so, kind of in connection with this particular issue, I'm just wondering if we can do a little something to clean up this document. It's got hundreds of changes in there, and that's given us problems, when we're actually talking about the versions of it, about actually doing edits to it. So just, as for example, I mean, the faithful track changes, records every place where Marin Shermer has added a carriage return. Can we begin to actually, it seems like we have a methodology by which changes get added, but the methodology for, how changes get removed, comments get removed, all of that doesn't seem to be as robust. So I'm just wondering if there's some way that we can actually do that, because, I don't know the other members of the work group or the subcommittee know, but I mean, this has produced these sorts of technical problems where now I'm having troubles actually opening, editing, sending documents. My latest changes had to be actually cut and pasted into email, because the document itself, that we're working from, has grown quite complex recording wise, and is versions of it are crashing people's computers. I mean, it has huge files in it. I mean, huge image files, kind of all of these sorts of things. I'm just hoping that we can, as a subcommittee, say, could we get a cleaner version, that's easier for us to use? Because it's, I'm spending a fair amount of my time actually wrestling with the document, not with the issues.
Thanks, Ken. So we only have a couple more minutes. I think maybe we can respond to that, and we'll just call out some of our next agenda items so that we can pay close attention to it. I'm going to briefly do that just so we don't lose it. So the next items that we need to cover are common terms and definitions. We have some terms that are sort of in different sections of the document, so compiling those all in one place and then going through and just line by line making sure that the group is comfortable with those comments, or sorry, those common terms and definitions. We have appendices that need our attention. We haven't really spent any time on them, but they're looking relatively complete, so we want to get group approval on those. The recent intake volume section of the document just needs some attention, as well as the executive summary. And then finally, we have to go through the body of the work group report and just make sure that it's matching our expectations, especially in the introduction and conclusion. So I will briefly respond to Ken. I agree. I think we need a mechanism for closing out those comments and those proposed changes. Generally, that's the latest versions of the document have accepted a lot of the track changes. And unfortunately, we haven't really spent a lot of time as a subcommittee actually reviewing changes as a group. So we don't get a lot of opportunities to actually get group feedback like we did today with findings and recommendations. But I think in my mind, that's my proposal is, get to a point where we can say, hey, are there any concerns with this section? If not, we'll remove all the track changes and accept all the comments. That's how I'd like to do it, but we've spent very little time in total actually reviewing proposed changes, so they end up remaining proposed. So if anybody has any other thoughts on that piece, I think I just don't want to lose any proposed changes that we really haven't had a chance to review. Chuck.
No, I appreciate that, Daniel. I've got 2 computer screens up now, and my video card won't support another screen like Ginger's. So even if you could give you the power to, even hold the other document, but just kind of clean some up with your discretion. I mean, you're way ahead of it. That way, we've kind of got something to refer back to that's solid without juggling in the mind what's really been struck and what hasn't been approved, Daniel. So I appreciate if you could do that and use your discretion if everybody else agrees to it.
Thanks, Chuck. Any other comments on that? Sam, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as long as the group is giving permission, fine. I mean, there were times in the past where any kinds of acceptances or edits were, there were concern that somehow those were designed in a less than honorable way, and I don't think that's the case here. And so, if we've gone through stuff, go ahead and accept them, because you can accept them and they're still, depending on how you accept them and the view, you can just show them without those changes, can't you, Ken? I mean, Daniel, you can.
Yeah, and generally most of the stuff in the latest document is reflecting that. Just a lot of stuff is accepted. So yeah, we can definitely capture that.
And the final piece that I'm not sure is there yet, and if it is, great. But is there going to be additional charts and graphs to what was called section 4, where there are actually charts and figures? But because I haven't seen them recently, and I don't want to assume that they have gone away.
Yeah, in the latest version that I sent out, there are graphs that I think Ken's latest submission updated the graphs that were included in that former section 4. So I added those updated graphs to replace sort of the placeholder items that said, graph to be added. So those are in there currently.
Great. Okay, good. Don't want to miss them.
All right. Well, we are at our time for today. Any other final thoughts or closing ideas? Okay, so we have a scheduled meeting for the 8th. I really appreciate everyone's time and patience with this. So we'll see you on the 8th. I'll send out the latest version of what we have.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel.